September 2020, Cambridge and Copenhagen, the largest Viking DNA study ever run, 442 genomes, burial mounds, boat graves, monastery ruins, bones from Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Estonia, Ukraine, Russia, 6 years of collection, thousands of modern and ancient reference populations compared against every genome in the dataset. When the analysis was complete, lead researcher Professor Eske Willerslev said 5 words nobody expected after 6 years studying Norse warriors. The history books were wrong, not about Viking power, about Viking identity. The data showed something more complex, more diverse, and more connected to the rest of the human world than any textbook had ever described. And when scientists compared that Viking genome to modern Black American DNA, the connection nobody saw coming showed up in the data. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Let's start with what the study actually found. Because before you can understand the connection to Black American DNA, you have to understand what the Viking genome actually is. And it is not what most people assume. The 2020 Nature paper, led by Professor Willerslev and co-first authors Dr. Aesop Margarian and Professor Martin Sikora of the University of Copenhagen, sequenced 442 individuals from more than 80 archaeological sites. It was the most comprehensive ancient DNA analysis of the Viking world ever attempted, and it systematically demolished the popular image of the genetically homogeneous Norse warrior. What they found was this: Viking identity was not a genetic category, it was a cultural one. People who were buried with Viking swords, in Viking-style graves, with Viking ships and Viking grave goods were, in many cases, not genetically Scandinavian at all. 2 skeletons found in Orkney, Scotland, buried with Viking swords in full Viking burial style, turned out to be genetically almost identical to modern-day Irish and Scottish people. No Scandinavian ancestry, 0. They were Picts, Celtic speakers from northern Scotland, who had adopted Viking culture so completely that even in death, they presented themselves as Norse. A Viking, the data said, was not a bloodline. It was a choice, an identity, a way of life that anyone in the Viking world could adopt regardless of where their DNA came from. But that was just the beginning of what the genomes revealed. The study found that the genetic history of Scandinavia itself was far more complex than any prior model had suggested. Before the Viking Age even began, before the first longship raid on a British monastery in 793 CE, people from Southern Europe and Asia had already been moving into Scandinavia and mixing with the local population. Viking-era residents of Denmark and Sweden showed ancestry from ancient Anatolia that was more pronounced than in their immediate Scandinavian predecessors, meaning that just as the Viking Age was starting, a wave of Southern European genetic input had arrived in Scandinavia from the south. The Vikings, who then spread across the world, were not a pure, isolated Norse genetic stock. They were already a mixture, and as they traveled, raiding Britain, settling Iceland, establishing trade routes through Russia to Constantinople and Baghdad, colonizing the coast of France and turning into the Normans, reaching the shores of North America 5 centuries before Columbus. They mixed with every population they encountered, the Irish and Scottish genetic signatures in Viking Age Scandinavia, the Southern European signals in Danish Viking genomes, the Eastern genetic input from the Baltic and Russian steppe roots, and 2 individuals in the entire dataset buried in Viking contexts in Scandinavia during the later Viking Age in the 10th century, who carried haplogroup E1b1b, the haplogroup most associated with North Africa and the Horn of East Africa, present in Viking Age Scandinavia in small numbers, but present. The data confirmed what the trading routes had always implied. The Viking world was a connected world, and its connections reached further than anyone had drawn on a map. Before we go deeper, if you're new here, subscribe now. We cover the genetic stories that history left out. This is one of the most surprising ones we've told. Hit subscribe. Let's keep going now. Here's where Black American DNA enters the picture, and it enters through a door that most people have never thought to open. The average Black American genome carries approximately 24% European ancestry, the well-documented legacy of slavery, coercion, and 4 centuries of forced contact with European men on American soil. That European ancestry is not evenly distributed among European populations. It is concentrated in the British and Irish genetic cluster, the northwestern European Atlantic lineages that dominated the American plantation economy as owners, overseers, and managers. The Bright et al. 2015 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, which analyzed over 5,000 African American genomes, established this conclusively. The largest single European contributor to Black American DNA is the British and Irish cluster. But British DNA is not a simple or isolated thing. It is one of the most genetically layered populations in Europe, the accumulated result of wave after wave of migration, invasion, and settlement stretching back over 10,000 years. And one of the most significant of those waves came directly from Scandinavia, directly from the Vikings. The Vikings conquered and settled large parts of the British Isles, not briefly, not superficially, not in a way that left only a cultural footprint and no genetic trace. The Danelaw, the vast region of eastern and northern England that came under Danish Viking control following the Great Heathen Army's invasion in 865 CE, covered roughly half of England. York, which the Vikings renamed Jorvik, became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the entire medieval world, a Norse-run trading hub where merchants from Scandinavia, Ireland, the Islamic world, and the Baltic mingled and did business in the shadow of Norse longships docked in the river. Viking Dublin was founded from scratch by Norse settlers and became the most important Viking city outside of Scandinavia. The Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, and large parts of the Scottish coast and northern mainland were effectively Norse territory for centuries, more Norwegian than Scottish in language, culture, and governance. The Normans, who conquered England in 1066 and inserted themselves permanently into the English ruling class, were themselves Vikings. Norse settlers who had colonized northern France 2 generations earlier adopted the French language and then crossed the Channel to take the English throne. Their Norse DNA came with them, diluted by French admixture, yes, but present. The 2020 Nature study confirmed the genetic footprint of that entire centuries-long Norse presence. Approximately 6% of the modern British population carries identifiable Viking DNA in their genes, primarily through haplogroup 11 and specific subclades of R1I, the paternal lineages most strongly associated with Norse migration and settlement. In Orkney specifically, a 2015 University of Edinburgh study found that up to 25% of male DNA traces directly back to Scandinavian Vikings. In northern England, the heartland of the Danelaw, Norse genetic signatures appear at measurably elevated frequencies in the modern population compared to the rest of the country. That Norse DNA did not disappear when the Viking Age ended in 1066. It did not evaporate when the last longship was beached or the last Norse king was deposed. It became British DNA. It was passed from father to son through centuries of English, Scottish, and Irish families. In the Danelaw villages of Yorkshire, in the Norse-settled farms of Orkney, in the Dublin bloodlines that mixed Irish and Norse ancestry over 10 generations. And then, through the machinery of the transatlantic slave trade, that British DNA, Norse lineages and all, was written by force and by violence into the genome of Black Americans. This is the chain. Follow it carefully, because each link is real and documented. West Africans from the Yoruba, Mandinka, Igbo, Congo, and related ethnic groups are captured and transported to North America. Between 1619 and 1808, they are enslaved and forced to work on plantations owned and operated primarily by men of British and Irish descent. Those men, some of them carrying in their Y chromosomes the genetic signatures of Norse ancestors who had settled Britain 8 and 9 centuries earlier, father children with enslaved African women through rape, coercion, and the total absence of consent or legal protection. Those children carry the Y chromosome haplogroups of their fathers. Those haplogroups, R1b, R1a, and in smaller numbers, I1, include lineages that, if you trace them back far enough, lead through the Danelaw, through Viking Age York, through the Norse settlements of Orkney and the Scottish coast, all the way back to a longship that left a Norwegian fjord sometime between 800 and 1050 CE. The 2020 Catoctin furnace study, published in the journal Science, confirmed this chain with direct ancient DNA evidence. When researchers from the Smithsonian, Harvard, and 23andMe extracted DNA from the remains of 27 enslaved black individuals buried at a Maryland ironworks between 1774 and 1850, they found that many carried European ancestry on the paternal line, ancestry primarily from Britain and Ireland. Britain and Ireland, the countries where Viking genetic signatures are most concentrated outside of Scandinavia itself. The researchers were explicit. This European paternal ancestry reflects the sexual exploitation of enslaved people by their enslavers and others in positions of power. The Viking DNA in Black American genomes did not arrive through choice. It arrived through the same mechanism that put all European DNA into Black American genomes. But it is there, measurable, traceable, real. Now let's talk about the deeper genetic picture, the one that operates at the haplogroup level, below the level of recent historical events in the ancient lineages that predate the Vikings by tens of thousands of years. Because the connection between Black American DNA and Viking DNA does not only run through the plantation and the British colonial machine, it runs through the deep time of human prehistory. It runs through Africa. The dominant Y chromosome haplogroup among modern Scandinavians and Viking Age Scandinavians is haplogroup I1. This lineage is thought to have emerged approximately 27,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic, when anatomically modern humans were still sharing Europe with Neanderthals, and to have been carried by the ancient hunter-gatherers who survived the last ice age in refugia in southern Europe. When the ice sheets finally retreated, roughly 12,000 years ago, these hunter-gatherers moved northward and repopulated the Scandinavian peninsula. Haplogroup, where one is, in a real sense, one of the most ancient European lineages in existence. A survivor of the Ice Age that found its highest concentration in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, where it now represents approximately 35 to 40% of the male population. In parts of Western Norway, it climbs above 50%, but here's what haplogroup I1 actually is. At its deepest level, it is a subclade of haplogroup EJ, itself a subclade of the great haplogroup F, which emerged in Africa or South Asia roughly 65,000 to 70,000 years ago, shortly after the out of Africa migration. Every Y chromosome haplogroup that exists outside of Africa today, every R, every I, every J, every G, every N, is a descendant of that original out of Africa lineage. And that out of Africa lineage itself descends from haplogroup CT, which emerged inside Africa roughly 70,000 years ago from the same ancient African source that also gave rise to haplogroup E, the lineage that stayed in Africa, spread westward across the continent, and eventually became the dominant paternal signature of West Africa and, through the transatlantic slave trade, of Black Americans. The dominant Y chromosome haplogroup in Black American men is haplogroup E, specifically E1b1a, which originated in East Africa roughly 41,000 years ago and spread west across the continent over tens of thousands of years, becoming the defining paternal lineage of West and West Central Africa. It is carried by the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Mandinka, the Congo, the ancestral groups whose DNA forms the core of Black American ancestry. These two haplogroups, I1 in the Viking world, E1b1a in the Black American world, both trace their ultimate ancestry to the same African source. They diverged from a shared common ancestor more than 60,000 years ago, inside Africa, before any human migration to Europe had occurred. One branch stayed in Africa and differentiated across the continent into the West African lineages that became the ancestors of Black Americans. The other branch left Africa, moved north through the ancient Near East and into Europe, survived the Ice Age in refugia in southern Europe, emerged from the glaciers to repopulate the north, and eventually became the defining lineage of the Norse people who would one day raid the British coast and leave their DNA in the gene pool of a nation that would, centuries later, build the transatlantic slave trade. Both are branches of the same ancient African tree. The distance between them, genetically, chronologically, geographically, is the full measure of what 60,000 years of separate human history looks like. And yet that distance was collapsed in one specific and brutal way by the plantation economy of the American South. There is one more dimension to this story that the 2020 Viking genome study revealed, and it matters directly for understanding the full picture of what the comparison means. The study found that Viking identity was defined not by genetics, but by culture. Pictish people in Scotland became Vikings genetically indistinguishable from Norse warriors, not by having Scandinavian DNA, but by living inside the Viking world, adopting its practices, its burial rites, its language, its values, and its identity. Professor Søren Zinbæk, the Moesgaard Museum archaeologist who collaborated on the study, described it plainly. Viking identity was not limited to people with Scandinavian genetic ancestry. You became a Viking by how you lived and how you died, not by what your Y chromosome said. This finding has a profound mirror in Black American history. The people brought to America from West and West Central Africa were stripped of their names, their languages, their tribal identities, their religious practices, and their family structures. They were forced into a single legal and social category, Black, enslaved property, that deliberately erased the specificity of everything they had been before. The goal was total cultural replacement, total identity destruction. It did not work, not completely, not even close. Just as the Pictish people of Scotland found a way to operate within a Norse cultural framework while maintaining their genetic identity across generations, Black Americans maintained their African genetic core through everything. Through the Middle Passage, through 246 years of chattel slavery, through Jim Crow, through every system, policy, and institution designed to erase them from history and from themselves. The West African haplogroup E1B1A lineages are still the dominant paternal signal in Black American genomes today. Over 400 years after the first enslaved people arrived on American shores, the African genetic foundation remains intact, persistent, and measurable. Identity, the Viking genome study tells us, is not the same as genetics. And genetics, the Black American genome tells us, is not the same as erasure. The two things that slavery tried hardest to destroy, African identity and African biological continuity, both survived. So here's the full picture. Here's what the comparison between Black American DNA and Viking DNA actually shows. The Vikings were not a pure genetic group. They were a mixed, diverse, cosmopolitan people who absorbed genetic influence from across the known world, from Southern Europe, from the Slavic East, from the British Isles, from the Caucasus. Professor Villerslev was right. The history books needed updating. The Viking was not a race. The Viking was an idea, an identity, a set of practices adopted by people of many different genetic backgrounds who chose or were absorbed into the Norse world. The Black American genome carries, embedded within its European component, a measurable and traceable Norse signal, transmitted through the British and Irish paternal lineages that entered Black American DNA through the violence of slavery. That signal traces back through the Danelaw and the Norse settlements of Britain to the Viking Age longships. And those longships carried men whose haplogroup, I1 lineage, traces back 27,000 years to the ancient hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Europe, whose own deeper ancestry traces back to the same African source that also produced the West African lineages that are the core of Black American identity. Two branches of the same ancient African tree, separated by 60,000 years and thousands of miles, brought back together by the most violent economic system in modern history. The genome doesn't editorialize. It doesn't grieve. It doesn't argue. It simply shows what happened. And what it shows is older, stranger, more connected, and more deeply human than any history book ever chose to write down. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. Subscribe now so you are there when we drop it.